Welcome to your Artsy Girl podcast. I am your host, Christina Carrere. This is a podcast about art, poetry, writing, and anything about creativity. Sit back, relax, and get your dose of brain food to get your creative juices flowing. Hello, and welcome to episode 57. Today's featured guest is Majure Wilson. She has a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville and has worked as a writer, editor, and project manager in software development and investment banking in Dallas, New York, and London. She earned a master's degree in family and consumer sciences from the University of Tennessee at Martin and is now an author and registered dietitian in Jackson, Tennessee. She has just come out with a book entitled Some Woman Had to Fight: The Radical Life of Sue Shelton White. This biography explores the personal, political, and professional life of Sue Shelton White, a militant suffragist, pioneering Tennessee lawyer, and vocal leader in the controversial protests and tireless lobbying campaign for ratification of the 19th Amendment, granting women their equal right to vote 100 years ago. Everyone, please welcome my next featured guest, Wilson. Hi, Gay. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.
Before we get into your work, can you tell me and the audience where you're at and where you're from?
I live in Jackson, Tennessee, in the western part of Tennessee. I'm originally from closer to the Nashville area, outside the Nashville area, and then had kind of a nomadic life since, most of my adult years, many years in Dallas, Texas. Also lived in a couple of places in the United Kingdom and London, and then also in New York, and then kind of came full circle back to Tennessee about a dozen or so years ago. I think I really got the travel bug. I think as a child, my aunt was a flight attendant with United Airlines for 39 years and so my Christmas and birthday presents used to come from all over the world. So that kind of instilled in me the desire to see those places. I want to see those places eventually. Mm-hmm. So I think my first real expedition was in the 1991, where I gave away all my possessions in my car and got rid of everything and moved to Thailand.
Wow.
Left my job. I think I was a little burned out. I'd been working in the stock market for about 5 years, and I was 28 years old and burned out and angry. And I thought, I'm 28. I shouldn't be tired and burned out by 28. So I basically said, got rid of everything and moved to Chiang Mai, Thailand for a little while.
Oh, my goodness. For how long?
Oh, just a few months till I ran out of money.
Right.
Then came, but it was a great experience. Then came back to the States. But so mostly it's been with jobs. I've spent much of my career as doing editing, writing, publishing in the software industry, software development, and also in the stock market, investment banking. So that kind of took me to Dallas, to New York, and to London, and to also Sheffield, England, up in northern England.
Nice. Well, I have the burning question is, you had such a rich life in the tech world. How did you come into writing then?
Well, it's interesting because I'd always just written, professionally. My original degree from decades ago is in journalism, but I ended up going the corporate route for most of my career. And then about 13 or so years ago, I decided the stock market, the ups and downs of the job market and the investment banking was too stressful for my age. So I went into healthcare, and I came back to the States and got a master's degree in dietetics. And so I'm actually a licensed registered dietitian now, and have been in healthcare for the past 12 or so years. But with that, I never wanted to even, I was just writing medical notes basically for all those years, for the last years. But I've still felt the yearn to, I get back to my journalism roots, but had to do it on the side, obviously, while working full time. So at nights and weekends and so forth. And I think with this particular book I wrote, the biography of Sue Shelton White, that just I felt was my calling, I guess, I think, to write this biography. Specifically because she's from here in Jackson.
Yes, this is an interesting topic, and your book is on an interesting topic as well. But before we get into that, one more question. You were referred to me by my Filipino writer friend Tony Robles, whom I've featured here twice on the show. Can you tell me, how did you guys get to know each other?
Oh yes, we love that story. We treasure that story. My family, much of my family is actually, even though I'm in Tennessee and originally from Tennessee, much of my family is on the West Coast. My brother and sister-in-law live up on Whidbey Island. My nephews all on the Olympic Peninsula. So I have family in Washington, and also I have family in Oakland. Down in Oakland. So my husband and I were visiting my family, my niece and her family in Oakland, and we were wandering in the city through Chinatown and kind of headed out of Chinatown, and we were walking down just street. We love to just say, when we travel, just say, what's down that street? Let's go down that one. See what we find. We never have an itinerary. We just want to see what we find. So we heard music coming out of this one door. We were walking past this lovely jazz tunes coming out of this one door. So we said, let's go in and see what's happening in there. And it turned out it was the International House, and it was music playing by this really fantastic band and singer, and that's where we met Tony, and we just ended up, my husband and he, became good friends. We stayed in touch, and every time we made a priority, every time we went to out to Oakland to the East Bay to see my niece, we always made sure seeing Tony Robles was on our agenda as well. So now he's on our side of the country. So now he's in North Carolina. So
I know.
He's actually on our side of the country now. So we're trying to coordinate how we might be able to see each other.
That's awesome. Well, he told me you have a book out, and it is interesting because it's about Sue Shelton White, a militant suffragist, also a Tennessee lawyer at the time. So can you tell us, how did you come about with the idea and the process and all that good stuff?
Yeah, I appreciate this because this was my passion. She's just become my hero. She's actually Sue Shelton White was from here in Jackson, Tennessee, and she was actually our first female lawyer here. And we have a statue of her in front of our city hall here in Jackson. Mm-hmm. But prior to her becoming a lawyer, she was actually prominent in the suffrage movement. And I know I'm a little bit partial, but she is actually probably the key person who made sure that Tennessee was the final state to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920. And so Tennessee, we're very proud of. We were the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment in order to grant women their equal right to vote, which they should have certainly had all along. But that Tennessee, by ratification in Tennessee, women were in time to vote for the 1921 presidential election. And basically, Sue Shelton White worked closely with Alice Paul with the National Women's Party. She was in the militant branch of the suffrage movement, and she was she was head of the Tennessee campaign for the National Women's Party. And because her early career in her 20s was as a court reporter and a stenographer, she knew the system. She knew the players here in Tennessee. She knew the legislators. She was incredibly diplomatic and knew who to contact and how to get that ratification passed. So even the New York Times in Sue Shelton White's obituary credit her with that successful ratification of the 19th Amendment in Tennessee in 1920, which put the women's vote over the top. That last state that was needed was Tennessee. That we were the only one left who could make it happen. And Sue Shelton White was really the driving force behind it. So I think she really, one of the reasons for the book is we're very proud of her suffragist history. And then she later joined, she was buddies with Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR. She joined FDR's New Deal later in the early 1930s. But her biographies are always what called missing years. Because it said always in her biography, there's always one sentence that says, and from 1926 to 1930, she went home to Jackson, Tennessee, and practiced law. And that was it.
Yeah.
And I thought,
little do we know that she was part of the movement down there. Were the demonstrations violent as they were up north?
Well, she actually did her down here. It was mostly they were doing lectures, like the suffragists came across the South, doing the Dixie tour. They called it their Dixie tour, driving through the South and giving lectures and so forth. But the protest, she was actually living in D.C. During in the headquarters of the National Woman's Party, and was part of the protests and the parades and the protests. And that's she was actually arrested, and that's where I go in 1919. She was actually arrested and jailed, and that's kind of in terms of a sample reading, I'd be happy to give because I think it's interesting. I think it's particularly interesting today. Because the thing we don't really think about is the suffragists, the campaign, the parades, the arrests, the protests, the pickets in front of the White House, they were all taking place in the context of both World War I was going on and the Spanish flu pandemic.
Right.
So this was all occurring, and I think it's an interesting, a wonderful example of major social transformation during a pandemic. That is possible because the suffragists did it.
Isn't it interesting, though, the parallels right now, now that we're having the marches and the protests of George Floyd and the pandemic. Isn't that interesting?
And it's exactly, and that's the amazing thing to me is because the suffragists were not only going up against the anti-suffragists, which included, you'd be surprised how many women were anti-suffragists.
I believe it.
The suffragists were also up against they were called unpatriotic because they were protesting during World War I. And so they were considered to, the more moderate factions of the suffragist movement, claimed they were not being patriotic. And then there also had the Spanish flu pandemic was occurring at the time. So they did
100 years later. It's like a parallel.
We're in this. Yeah, exactly. But I think it's inspiring that we can see those societal shifts. That women, they did get that right to vote. So that change did happen. So I think that can be inspiration.
If anybody hasn't really delved into the women's suffrage movement, I suggest watching the Iron Jawed Angels. I've watched that many years ago. And these women were up against such violence against them for, protesting, for wanting the right to vote. And it's amazing. 100 years of protest and to get the right to vote. It's just baffling.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful movie that I saw that probably just a few weeks ago and stumbled upon it, and it's a fantastic movie. Absolutely agree.
So, do you happen to have a little excerpt of your novel? Oh, first, before we do that again, can you tell me what the premise of your novel is? Is it about her life or a segment, or tell us a little bit more?
Well, it's a biography, so it is actually a biography, and it starts with her suffrage work, and then also through her time as a suffragist, both in Tennessee and in Washington. And then I go into, this was a very exciting part of it, is the local archivist here and I, they were wonderful. They pulled out old, dusty court record books from almost 100 years ago.
Nice.
And we poured through those musty old books, looking for Sue Shelton White's court cases from almost 100 years ago, from the 1920s. And try, because what I wanted to see was, during those years she was back here after the her suffragist work, and after the 19th Amendment passed, but before she went back to Washington, D.C., when she did go back to Washington, D.C. at the request of the Roosevelts, she was one of the first lawyers for the Social Security Administration. But what I wanted to also focus on in the book is her years as a lawyer. And she was gutsy. Sue Shelton White was gutsy because what she did, she was working at the time in D.C. for a U.S. Senator, the Tennessee U.S. Senator McKellar, and she was running his office. She was basically his chief of staff. And so, but he wouldn't give her the job permanently. And she said, this is her friends were like, this is her job. Why aren't you giving her a job? Well, the U.S. Senator gave the chief of staff job, or the running his office job, to his brother. So she lost her. She'd been doing the job for a long time, didn't get the job because it went to his brother. But the senator wanted Sue Shelton White to stay on board. And she said, no way, I'm out of here. So, because that was my job and I deserved it. So she wasn't going to put up with that. So again, another amazing gutsy move for a woman in the 1920s. She had a new law degree. While she was working for the senator during the day and running his office, she went to law school at night. So she got a law degree in Washington, but she needed some experience. So what she did is, after she quit the senator's office because he gave her job to his brother, she wrote to a lawyer here in Jackson, Tennessee, who was well regarded, Hugh Anderson. And I love her approach, because she said, look, I have a law degree, but I don't have the experience. You have the experience. She goes, I have some cash, and I bet you could use it. So I would like to buy a stake in your law firm. So I want to buy a stake in your law firm. And I agree that you're the experienced lawyer, and I'll learn from you. But I want equal billing to the public, equal billing. I want to be so, and in exchange for basically my money, for my, my share of the stuff. And I want to be in public, be equal to you. And he took it. And that's when the law firm of Anderson and White was born.
Wow.
And so it was a really gutsy move for a woman in 1926.
Yeah.
But he took the cash, and their law firm was born. So that was a fun part of the book, was researching who did they represent as Anderson and White in the 1920s. And not surprisingly, they represented women, often either women suing corporations or women in divorce cases. They represented the lone individual going up against maybe the county, the government, going up against the corporation. So I kind of wanted to see, was there a thread in who she took on as her clients in her new law practice? And did she represent, she always fought for the underdog in so many ways, and I saw that in her law practice as well. So, but it's a kind of a full biography until her death. She died young at age 55.
Oh, wow. It was young.
Yeah. But it's kind of covers it's a myriad. She was a book reviewer. I went to, in her book, she reviewed books, and so I go through her book reviews that she published, and so it was amazing in her 55 years what she accomplished. Sue Shelton White accomplished. I'm in awe, really.
Interesting. I mean, I can talk to you almost for days regarding this, but just go ahead and jump in and share with us, say, a little excerpt.
Okay. What I was going to do is just a brief excerpt of this was during the protests in front of the White House. So what the National Woman's Party did is they'd have these fires they called watchfires in front of the White House because they were so frustrated with President Woodrow Wilson was saying he supported suffrage, but really nothing was happening in the Senate. Nothing was happening to move the amendment through. So this is the reading starts. In 1917, during World War I, the National Woman's Party was reviled by many for daring to stage militant protests in Washington, D.C. in a time of war. Less than 2 years later, on February 9, 1919, Sue Shelton White was center stage in the protests. She was among almost 100 women who marched to the White House and gathered shoulder to shoulder around an urn. A curious crowd of several thousand people had gathered, standing for 2 hours, listening and watching the spectacle in anxious anticipation of what may come next. A fire was lit. Flames leapt skyward. White held high the words of an unfulfilled pledge by President Wilson to extend democracy to women. Then she dropped the pledge in the fire, her anger burning at his empty promises. A cartoon 3-foot paper effigy of President Wilson also went up in flames. Sue White and 64 other women were arrested by civil and military police. After the principal speaker, Mrs. Henry Havemeyer, was arrested, more women dashed to the podium to speak in her place. Each was grabbed and arrested as she made her desperate attempt. The women kept up their protests and shouted at spectators as they were shoved into patrol wagons. At the police station, the women refused to post bond and were jailed. Sue White served 5 days in the filthy, harsh conditions of the Lorton Women's Workhouse in Virginia. The arrests of the suffragists brought mixed reactions in White's hometown. The editor of a neighboring small-town newspaper complained. He said the female nuisances who made themselves conspicuous and offensive by picketing the White House for the purpose of annoying the president and members of his cabinet are just where they ought to be, in jail, and should be allowed to remain there until they promise and make bond if necessary to go to their homes, where they are doubtless of minimum use, and God pity the men they go back to. And so that was
wow.
That was that. So they had support, and then they obviously were going up against some tough enemies. So,
can you tell just a little bit? Did you learn anything about her childhood and what built her character like that?
Yeah, she's from a small town outside of Jackson called Henderson, Tennessee. So she had a rural childhood. But I think that thing that really forged her was she lost both of her parents when she was fairly young. Her one parent she lost when she was 9 years old. I believe her father, and then her mother when she was 13 years old. Mm. So she and her brother and sister really had to forge some independence because they lost their parents quite young. Okay. And I think that was, and she was taught to do the things her brother could do. She was a carpenter. She could build, all those things. So, but I think she had to learn that independence because she lost her parents at that young age.
I see. Where can people get your book?
On Amazon, and Barnes and Noble, Amazon, any of the online retailers. Those are the two major ones that I've encountered, and it's in print form and in ebook as well. So. Mm-hmm. And so, Some Woman, I think just a note about where the title of it, Some Woman Had to Fight, The Radical Life of Sue Shelton White. Mm-hmm. And I think that I get that because one of my favorite quotes of hers, she was absolutely hysterical. She had a really caustic wit as well, was known for that. But she, at one point, she did say, if you stand in your accepted place today, some woman had to fight yesterday. So that's where I got the title, Some Woman Had to Fight.
Right. Wow. Interesting. Yeah. I love history. I mean, so this is very appealing to me. I mean, but so much, we still have yet to learn about our history, isn't it? Mm-hmm.
I just think that's why I think one of my my favorite types of books to look for is I'm always looking for books about women who had major contributions through history but got overlooked in the process. And I think there's more and more people coming out. There's a wonderful book called The Woman Who Smashed Codes, and it's about Elizabeth Friedman. And I love this writer. I believe his name is Joseph Fagon. And that book is about her husband got all this. She was a code breaker. But her husband, Elizabeth Friedman's husband, got all the notice, and so now there's a book about her because she was actually in many ways more clever than her husband and contributed more. But I love books that are looking to explain the stories of women that have not been told before, and I'm the nonfiction those stories.
So, do you have any other ideas or books in mind for your next project?
Oh, no, that's a good question because we have I was very, very fortunate because Sue Shelton White's papers, her actual papers, personal papers, are up at Harvard at the Radcliffe College, But I was so discouraged. Thought, well, I can't get to Cambridge, the last couple of years. But we had a digital copies. A wonderful local citizen had donated the digital versions of her papers to our local library, and because what came with that was a whole all of the digital papers of many of the Southern suffragists are in the same collection. So I could see other stories coming out of the suffragists, particularly focusing on the Southern suffragists, since we do have their papers available. And then also I'm thinking about as I said, my aunt was a flight attendant for almost 40 years with United, and I have her scrapbooks. Yeah. Photo albums, and I'm finding them incredibly fascinating from that date back to her travels from the 60s and the 70s. So I'm thinking that I think would be a fascinating book, basically telling the story of her scrapbooks.
Right. So what kind of advice would you give to someone who's interested in doing nonfiction or biography like you? Can you just, give, what would you tell them?
Yeah, and it's because you want original sources, and that's the tricky part. I think what I did is I think look for stories, and they don't always have to be famous people, but you find stories locally to you. I think there are local to everyone, there are fascinating untold stories of real people in the history of their town or their state, and see what your libraries have in terms of, who is someone's personal papers stored in a library in your area, some original sources, or do you have contacts, but who may have scrapbooks or journals of someone who, I think everybody lives near someone and could write a biography of a fascinating person in their area, who especially, I'm especially prone to writing about women, a woman in their area who maybe did something that would make a fascinating story, and you have access to the original stories.
That is a great idea for any writer to take that up because, like you said, there are people in history, women who have done and accomplished a lot of things and who have not been, been told yet. So
their story's not been told. And there's, right. I bet everybody can come up with one. I'll bet everybody can come up with one, even if it's someone in your family, right. But everybody's got a great story somewhere nearby that they can tell of somebody, I think.
Right. And you can also tell it through their perspective, or, there's very different ways of approaching how to write someone's story. But you choose the biography route.
In this case, and I think there's biography route. There's correspondence. I love books that are books of correspondence.
Oh yes, back in the day when they did write letters. The Virginia Woolf letters, the Sylvia Plath letters. I mean, I'm totally enamored by those. I've read those. That's
correspondence. That's some of the things, especially Sue Shelton White. I would love to I wish I could have known her, because she's very, very funny. I think just one quote I wanted to give you this is the one thing that just made me laugh. She said she advocated to, and this is the 1920s, you have to think about, that traditional gender roles, don't adhere to traditional gender roles. She was saying, look, think out, you gotta, my favorite quote about that, where she talked about gender roles, she said, if a woman finds that she has a natural bent for playing the stock market and none at all for playing the piano, her energies are no longer limited to bad piano playing.
So true.
And then she says, look, if the husband is a better cook, why shouldn't he cook dinner?
Exactly.
And the woman goes and support the family. And these are all things she's writing in like the 1920s, which was brilliant.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing your work. It's great talking to you, and wow, I look forward to more of what you write about. Seriously.
Well, I've had a wonderful time. I sure appreciate it, Christina, so much. This has been wonderful, and I really appreciate the opportunity, because I really enjoyed talking about Sue Shelton White and the process of us telling stories.
Yeah.
About women whose stories perhaps have not been told completely.
Well, do stay in touch and tell Tony I said hello, and thanks for, him introducing you to me.
Absolutely. I will give him your best. He's wonderful. And then you have a wonderful rest of the weekend.
Well, everyone, that is it for now. Please tune in next week for my next featured guest. In the meantime, have a productive and creative week. Bye, Gay.
Bye. Thank you so much.